The matchmaker's parlor reeked of desperation and dying roses. Eleanor Hartwell sat rigidly on the velvet settee, her gloved hands clasped so tightly in her lap that her knuckles showed white through the thin fabric. Across from her, Mrs. Pemberton adjusted her wire-rimmed spectacles and consulted the leather-bound ledger that contained the names of every eligible bachelor in 3 counties. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Miss Hartwell, the woman said with barely concealed exasperation, I'm afraid Mr. Whitmore has also declined the introduction. She turned the page with unnecessary force. That makes 17 gentlemen this month alone. Eleanor's spine straightened further, if such a thing were possible. At 28, she had long passed the age when most women were considered marriageable material in the frontier town of Millfield Creek. Her auburn hair, though lustrous, was pulled back in a severe bun that did nothing to soften the sharp angles of her face. Her dress, while clean and well-mended, spoke of practicality rather than fashion. A black wool that had seen too many winters and bore the subtle scent of the apothecary herbs she worked with daily. And his reasons? Eleanor's voice remained steady, though something flickered in her green eyes. Mrs. Pemberton cleared her throat uncomfortably. He felt that a woman of your advanced years and particular temperament might not make a suitable wife for a man of his social standing. The truth was far more cutting than Mrs. Pemberton's diplomatic phrasing suggested. Eleanor was too tall, too educated, too opinionated. She ran the town's only apothecary shop with a fierce independence that made men uncomfortable. She could read Latin medical texts as easily as recipe cards, could perform minor surgeries when Dr. Caldwell was away, and had once dressed down the mayor's son for mistreating his horse in front of half the town. Eleanor rose gracefully, her height making the portly matchmaker crane her neck upward. Thank you for your efforts, Mrs. Pemberton. I believe it's time I accepted that marriage is simply not in my future. Now don't be hasty, dear, Mrs. Pemberton protested, though her relief was evident. Perhaps we might look into the mining camps. There are always men there in need of wives, though they might not be of the caliber you're accustomed to. Eleanor's laugh was bitter. I think we both know my caliber has been found wanting by every man in 4 counties. Good day, Mrs. Pemberton. The October air bit at Eleanor's cheeks as she stepped onto the wooden sidewalk. Millfield Creek bustled with afternoon activity, merchants calling their wares, children chasing hoops, women gathering in clusters to exchange gossip. Eleanor walked among them like a ghost, visible but not truly seen, acknowledged with polite nods, but never included in the warm circles of conversation. At the dry goods store, she overheard Mrs. Fletcher whispering to her daughter about the upcoming harvest dance. I do hope you'll catch young Samuel's eye, dear. A girl your age shouldn't wait too long. Look at Eleanor Hartwell, a cautionary tale if ever there was one. Eleanor's fingers tightened around her market basket, but she said nothing. She had learned years ago that defending herself only made things worse. Instead, she gathered her supplies with efficient silence and made her way back to her shop. The Hartwell apothecary sat at the end of Main Street, squeezed between the blacksmith and the funeral parlor, a fitting location, some townspeople joked cruelly. The shop had been her father's before his death 5 years prior, and her grandfather's before that. Eleanor had inherited not just the business, but the secret recipes, the careful knowledge of which herbs could heal and which could harm. The bell above the door chimed as she entered, the familiar scent of dried lavender and willow bark enveloping her like a comforting embrace. Sunlight filtered through jars of colorful tinctures on the windowsill, casting rainbow patterns across the wooden floor. This was her sanctuary, the one place where she felt truly competent and valued. She was grinding fresh ginger root when the bell chimed again. Eleanor looked up, expecting to see Mrs. Garcia with her weekly request for arthritis remedy. Instead, a massive figure filled the doorway, blocking out the afternoon light. Jasper Kane stood well over 6 feet tall, his shoulders broad enough to fill the narrow entrance completely. His black hat cast shadows across features that were more weathered stone than flesh. A strong jaw, high cheekbones, and eyes a color of winter storms. A long coat hung from his frame like a shroud, and Eleanor could see the worn grip of a pistol at his hip. The townspeople spoke of Jasper Kane in hushed whispers when they spoke of him at all. He was a bounty hunter who came through Millfield Creek perhaps 4 times a year, always alone, always silent. He conducted his business with Sheriff Morrison, collected any reward money due to him, and vanished back into the wilderness like smoke. Eleanor had seen him before, of course. In a town the size of Millfield Creek, everyone knew everyone by sight. But he had never entered her shop, never had cause to speak to her. Now he stood motionless in her doorway, studying her with an intensity that made her skin prickle. "Can I help you, Mr. Kane?" Her voice came out steadier than she felt. He stepped into the shop, removing his hat to reveal dark hair that curled slightly at the ends. When he spoke, his voice was low and rough, like gravel rolling down a hillside. "Need something for pain?" Eleanor set down her mortar and pestle. "What kind of pain? Headache, joint pain, injury?" Jasper's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Gunshot, clean through the shoulder, already stopped bleeding." She studied him more carefully, noting the way he held his left arm, slightly rigid, the barely visible dark stain on his coat. "You should see Dr. Caldwell. Doc's out of town. Besides, heard you're better with this kind of thing." Eleanor felt a flush of unexpected pride. She gestured toward the back room. "Let me see it properly." The back room served as her workspace and living quarters. A narrow staircase led to her small apartment above, but the main floor contained her laboratory, shelves lined with glass bottles, dried herbs hanging from the rafters, and a sturdy table where she could examine patients. When necessary, Jasper followed her into the room, his presence making the space feel suddenly cramped. Eleanor lit an additional lamp and gestured to the table. "Shirt off, please." He hesitated for a moment, then shrugged out of his coat and began unbuttoning his shirt. Eleanor busied herself gathering supplies, trying not to think about the impropriety of the situation. An unmarried woman alone with a man, helping him undress. It would be scandal enough to ruin what little reputation she had left. When she turned back, her breath caught. Jasper's torso was a map of scars. Old bullet wounds, knife cuts, and what looked like burn marks from a brand. The fresh wound was a neat hole through the meat of his left shoulder, clean but angry red around the edges. Eleanor forced herself to focus on the medical aspects. "This needs cleaning. The bullet went straight through, which is good. No fragments to remove." She began preparing a cleaning solution. "How long ago?" 2 days. "And you've been riding with this?" She looked at him sharply. "You could have bled to death, developed infection, lost the use of your arm permanently." Something that might have been amusement flickered in his eyes. "Didn't have much choice. Had to deliver my quarry to the marshal in Copper Falls first." Eleanor cleaned the wound as gently as she could, though Jasper never flinched or made a sound. Up close, she could see that he was younger than she'd thought, perhaps early 30s. His face had the kind of hardness that came from living rough, but there was something else there, a careful intelligence that surprised her. "You're very good at this," he said quietly as she applied a healing salve. "My father started teaching me when I was 8, said a woman should be able to tend wounds as well as any man." She began wrapping the shoulder with clean bandages. "Some people think that makes me unsuitable for marriage. Some people are fools." The comment was delivered so matter-of-factly that Eleanor almost smiled. The entire male population of this county would disagree with you. Can't say I care much for their opinions." Eleanor secured the bandage and stepped back. "Keep this clean and dry. Change the dressing daily. The salve will prevent infection and speed healing. Come back in 3 days so I can check it." Jasper pulled his shirt back on, wincing slightly as the fabric passed over the bandaged shoulder. "What do I owe you?" $3. He reached for a leather pouch and counted out the money. As he handed it to her, their fingers brushed briefly. Eleanor felt calluses on his palms, the roughness of hands that had seen hard use. "Thank you, Miss Hartwell." The fact that he knew her name shouldn't have surprised her. Everyone in town knew everyone's name, but the way he said it, with a careful pronunciation that suggested he'd thought about it before, made something flutter in her chest. After he left, Eleanor found herself touching the spot where their hands had met. She scolded herself for being foolish. Jasper Kane was dangerous, transient, utterly unsuitable for any kind of attachment. But that night, she lay awake thinking about the intelligence in his storm-grey eyes and the careful gentleness of his hands when he'd counted out her payment. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. 3 days later, he returned as instructed. Eleanor unwrapped the bandage to find the wound healing cleanly. The angry redness faded to a healthy pink. "You're a fast healer," she observed, applying fresh salve. "Years of practice." This time, he didn't leave immediately after she finished. Instead, he stood by her window, looking out at the street where the afternoon crowd was thinning. "Heard talk in the saloon," he said finally, "about you." Eleanor's hands stilled on the bandages she was putting away. "Oh?" "Some young fool named Whitmore, bragging about how he turned down the Spinster apothecary. Said she was too old and too strange for any decent man." Heat flamed in Eleanor's cheeks. "Mr. Kane, I hardly thought you should know what kind of man you're wasting your time on." Eleanor turned to face him, anger making her bold. "And what would you suggest, Mr. Kane? Should I lower my standards to the mining camps? Should I advertise in distant newspapers for any man desperate enough to overlook my advanced age and unsuitable temperament?" Jasper studied her for a long moment. "Maybe you should consider that the problem isn't with you." Before she could respond, he was gone, leaving Eleanor staring at the empty doorway and wondering what he'd meant. November brought the first snow, and with it, the harvest dance. Eleanor watched from her shop window as couples streamed into the town hall, the women's dresses bright splashes of color against the white ground. She had stopped attending social functions years ago. There was only so much pity and whispered commentary a person could endure. The bell chimed, and Eleanor turned, expecting a late customer. Instead, Jasper Kane stood in her doorway again, snow dusting his dark coat. She noticed he wasn't favoring his shoulder anymore. "How's the wound?" she asked. "Healed clean. You do good work." He stepped further into the shop, snowflakes melting in his hair. "Heard the whole town's at the dance tonight." "Most of it, yes, but not you." Eleanor busied herself organizing bottles that didn't need organizing. "I'm not much for dancing, Mr. Kane." "That's not why you're not there." The simple statement hung between them. Eleanor set down the bottle in her hands and looked at him directly. "No, it's not, but I see no reason to subject myself to another evening of watching happy couples while being reminded of my own failures." "Their loss," Jasper said quietly. "Is it?" The words came out more bitter than she'd intended. "I'm 28 years old, Mr. Kane. I've been turned down by every eligible man in 3 counties. At some point, one has to accept that perhaps the fault lies with oneself." Jasper removed his hat, running his fingers through his dark hair. "Mind if I tell you what I see when I look at you, Miss Hartwell?" Eleanor's heart began to beat faster, but she nodded. I see a woman who can read Latin and mix medicines that actually work. I see someone who's never afraid to speak her mind, even when it costs her. I see hands that can heal gunshot wounds and eyes that don't flinch when they see scars. He paused, studying her face. I see a woman strong enough to run a business alone, brave enough to challenge the mayor's son, and honest enough to tell a man when he's being a fool. Eleanor felt tears threatening. That's very kind, Mr. Kane, but I also see every man in this town walking past the best thing they'll ever have a chance at, too blind and stupid to recognize it. The words hit her like a physical blow. Eleanor sank onto the stool behind her counter, staring at this mysterious man who had somehow seen more in a few brief encounters than anyone else had seen in 28 years. "Why are you telling me this?" she whispered. Jasper stepped closer, his grey eyes intense. "Because tomorrow I'm leaving for Kansas Territory, tracking job. I'll be gone for weeks, maybe months. And I need you to know that when I come back, I'm going to court you, Eleanor Hartwell, properly, respectfully, because you deserve a man who knows your worth." Eleanor's mind went blank. She stared at him, certain she'd misheard. What? I know what people say about me. Dangerous, killer, not the kind of man a decent woman should associate with. They're probably right, but I've never wanted anything in my life the way I want the chance to make you happy. Mr. Kane, I don't understand. We barely know each other. I know enough. He moved closer, close enough that she could smell the leather and winter air that clung to his coat. I know you're the only woman I've ever met who didn't flinch when she saw my scars. I know you care more about doing what's right than what's proper. I know you've got a backbone of steel and a heart big enough to help anyone who needs it. Eleanor felt the world tilting on its axis. Jasper. His name felt strange on her lips. I'm not asking for an answer now. I'm asking you to think about it while I'm gone. Think about whether you might consider letting someone choose you for once, instead of the other way around. He reached into his coat and pulled out a small wrapped package. Open it after I leave. Before Eleanor could protest, he was gone, the bell chiming his departure. She stood alone in her shop, holding the package and feeling as though she'd just survived an earthquake. With trembling fingers, she unwrapped the paper to reveal a small wooden carving, a rose perfectly detailed down to the tiny thorns on its stem. It was beautiful, clearly crafted with patience and skill. She turned it over and found initials carved into the base. J.C. Eleanor sank onto her stool, staring at the carved rose. No one had ever given her a gift that wasn't practical. A book. For her birthday from her father, a shawl from an elderly patient. This was beautiful for beauty's sake alone. That night, she lay in her narrow bed above the shop, turning the wooden rose over in her hands. Jasper Kane wanted to court her. A man women whispered about in equal parts fear and fascination wanted to court the spinster of Millfield Creek. Eleanor had long ago resigned herself to spinsterhood. She'd convinced herself that independence was better than settling for a man who saw her as a burden or an obligation. But Jasper hadn't looked at her that way. He'd looked at her as though she were something precious, something worth fighting for. The next morning, Eleanor woke to find the town buzzing with news. Jasper Kane had left before dawn, riding hard toward the Kansas border. Sheriff Morrison confirmed he was tracking the notorious Dalton gang, wanted for bank robbery and murder. Dangerous business, the sheriff told anyone who would listen. That man's got ice water in his veins, takes a special kind of person to hunt other men for a living. Eleanor listened to the gossip with growing unease. Jasper was riding into danger, chasing killers through hostile territory. He might not come back at all. The thought hit her like a punch to the stomach. Days passed, then weeks. Eleanor found herself watching the road out of town, hope and dread warring in her chest every time she saw riders approaching. The wooden rose lived on her bedside table, the first thing she saw each morning and the last thing she touched each night. November turned to December, bringing harsh winds and deeper snow. Christmas came and went with no word from Jasper. Eleanor began to fear the worst. Bounty hunting was deadly work. Men like the Daltons didn't go quietly. It was New Year's Eve, when Mrs. Pemberton came bustling into the shop, her cheeks red with cold and excitement. "Miss Hartwell, have you heard? Such news! Young Mr. Whitmore is getting married to that pretty Thompson girl from the next county. The engagement was announced this morning." Eleanor felt nothing but a mild sense of relief. How lovely for them. "Yes, well, I'm sure he'll be very happy, though between you and me, I always thought the Thompson girl a bit simple. But then, men don't always choose the most suitable wives, do they?" After Mrs. Pemberton left, Eleanor reflected on how little the news affected her. Just months ago, the announcement would have felt like another door slamming shut. Now she realized she didn't care at all about Mr. Whitmore or his bride. Her thoughts were entirely consumed with grey eyes and a low, gravelly voice promising to court her properly. January brought the worst blizzard in decades. For 3 days, snow fell so heavily that no one could venture outside. Eleanor huddled in her shop, keeping the fire burning and rationing her food supplies. When the storm finally cleared, the drifts were so high that doorways disappeared and travel became impossible. It took a week for the roads to be passable again. On the 8th day, as Eleanor was sweeping snow from her front step, she heard the thunder of hoofbeats approaching at speed. She looked up to see a lone rider cresting the hill outside town, his horse's breath visible in the frigid air. Her heart stopped. Jasper Kane sat tall in the saddle despite obvious exhaustion. His coat was torn, his hat was missing, and even from a distance, Eleanor could see the slump of his shoulders that spoke of bone-deep weariness. But he was alive. He rode straight to her shop, dismounting with careful movements that suggested fresh injuries. Eleanor dropped her broom and ran to him. "Jasper, you're hurt!" He looked at her as though she were a mirage he was afraid might disappear. "Eleanor, come inside. Let me see what's wrong." She helped him into the shop, noting the way he moved with careful precision. In the back room, he shrugged out of his torn coat to reveal a blood-stained shirt and what looked like knife cuts along his ribs. "The Daltons?" she asked, already gathering supplies. "Dead, all of them." His voice was flat, exhausted. Took longer than expected. Had to track them through 3 states. Eleanor cleaned and dressed his wounds with practiced efficiency, her touch gentle but sure. The knife cuts were shallow but numerous, and there was a bullet graze along his left forearm that was already healing. "You need rest," she said finally. "Real rest." Jasper caught her hand as she moved to put away her supplies. "Eleanor, I need to ask you something." She looked down at their joined hands, surprised by how right they looked together. "What? These past months, riding through Kansas, sleeping under stars, dodging bullets. You know what I thought about every single night?" Eleanor's heart hammered against her ribs. "What?" "Coming home to you." The words hung in the air between them. Eleanor stared at this dangerous, complicated man who had somehow decided she was worth coming home to. "I meant what I said before I left," he continued, his grey eyes holding hers. "I want to court you, Eleanor. I want to show this whole damn town what they missed. I want to build something with you." Eleanor felt tears gathering. "Jasper, you don't really know me. Not really. I'm difficult. I'm stubborn. I have opinions about everything. I'm nearly 30 years old and I've never even been kissed." A slow smile spread across his weathered face. "Good. That means I get to be the first." Before Eleanor could respond, before she could think or protest or talk herself out of it, Jasper's hand moved to cup her face. His thumb traced along her cheekbone, and then he was kissing her, soft and careful and infinitely sweet. When they broke apart, Eleanor felt dizzy. "Oh, Eleanor Hartwell," Jasper said softly, "will you let me court you properly? Will you let me choose you the way you deserve to be chosen?" Eleanor looked into his storm-grey eyes and saw everything she had never dared hope for. Acceptance, admiration, and something deeper that made her breath catch. She thought of all the men who had turned her away, who had seen her as too much or not enough. She thought of the wooden rose on her bedside table and the way Jasper had looked at her that first day, as though she was something worth seeing. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, I will." And in that moment, in the back room of her little apothecary shop, Eleanor Hartwell stopped being the spinster no one would marry and became the woman someone had chosen above every other bride in town. The news of Jasper Kane's courtship spread through Millfield Creek faster than wildfire in dry grass. Eleanor discovered this when Mrs. Fletcher cornered her at the general store 3 days after Jasper's return. "My dear Miss Hartwell," she said with false sweetness, "surely you can't be serious about entertaining the attentions of that bounty hunter." Eleanor straightened to her full height, drawing strength from the memory of Jasper's kiss. "I fail to see how my personal affairs concern you, Mrs. Fletcher. But think of your reputation, a man who kills for money, who's been seen drinking with outlaws and worse. What will people say?" "People have said quite enough about me already," Eleanor replied firmly. "Good day, Mrs. Fletcher." The older woman's face purpled with indignation, but Eleanor swept past her with newfound confidence. For the first time in her life, she didn't care what the town gossips thought. She had someone who valued her exactly as she was. Jasper proved true to his word about proper courtship. Each evening after closing her shop, he would arrive to walk her home. They would stroll through the town centre, as couples had done for generations, Eleanor's hand resting lightly on his arm. The townspeople stared, some with curiosity, others with obvious disapproval. "You know they're all watching," Eleanor murmured, one evening as they passed the hotel, where several women had gathered on the porch. "Let them watch," Jasper replied quietly. "They might learn something about how a woman should be treated." Their conversations revealed depths Eleanor hadn't expected. Jasper spoke little of his past, but she learned he'd grown up on a farm in Colorado before the war changed everything. He'd taught himself to read using his mother's Bible and could quote poetry when he thought no one was listening. He brought her books from his travels, wildflowers that grew only in distant meadows, and stories of places she'd only read about. The wealthy families of Millfield Creek watched with growing alarm. Mr. Whitmore, recently married but still nursing wounded, pride over Eleanor's rejection, made increasingly snide comments whenever their paths crossed. "Kane's a killer, Eleanor," he said one afternoon when she encountered him outside the bank. "You think he'll change for you? Men like that don't settle down." Eleanor looked at him with something approaching pity. "Thomas, you had your chance to know who I really am. You chose to see only what threatened you. Don't mistake others' courage for your own cowardice." His face flushed red, but Eleanor had already turned away. She was learning that the opinions of small men mattered far less than she'd once believed. Winter deepened, and with it came challenges Eleanor hadn't anticipated. Jasper's work meant uncertain absences, sometimes for days at a time. Each departure filled her with dread, each return with overwhelming relief. She began to understand what it meant to love someone whose profession courted danger. On February morning, she woke to find Jasper hadn't returned from what should have been a simple transport job to the county seat. Hours passed, then a full day. Eleanor paced her shop like a caged animal, unable to concentrate on anything. The second night, she was preparing to close when hoofbeats thundered down Main Street. Through her window, she saw Jasper riding hard, bent low over his horse's neck. Blood stained his coat. Eleanor ran outside as he dismounted, nearly falling. In his exhaustion, what happened? Ambush. 3 men tried to free the prisoner. His voice was strained with pain. "I'm fine, just need—" He swayed, and Eleanor caught him, feeling the warm wetness of blood through his coat. Together, they stumbled into her shop where she discovered a deep gash across his back and a bullet wound in his thigh, as she worked to clean and stitch his wounds. Anger warred with fear in her chest. "You could have been killed, but I wasn't." His grey eyes found hers. "I had something to come back to." The simple words broke something loose inside her. Eleanor had spent years building walls around her heart, protecting herself from disappointment. But watching this strong, dangerous man trust her with his pain, seeing the way he looked at her as though she were his anchor in a storm, made those walls crumble completely. "I love you," she whispered, the words slipping out before she could stop them. Jasper's hand found hers, his fingers interlacing with her own. "Eleanor Hartwell, I've loved you since the day I walked into your shop bleeding, and you didn't flinch. You saw straight through to my soul and somehow decided I was worth saving." The kiss that followed was different from their first, tender, desperate, full of promises neither had dared speak aloud. When they broke apart, Eleanor knew there was no going back. She belonged to this man as completely as he belonged to her. Spring brought new challenges and new joys. Jasper began building a house on the hill overlooking town, a real home where they could start their life together. Eleanor divided her time between her shop and helping with construction, learning to handle tools with the same precision she applied to mixing medicines. The engagement announcement in the local newspaper caused an uproar that Eleanor found more amusing than distressing. Several families threatened to take their business elsewhere until they realized she was the only competent healer for 20 miles. Mrs. Pemberton closed her matchmaking business entirely, claiming she couldn't bear to see the natural order of things so thoroughly disrupted. But there were surprising allies too. Dr. Caldwell, returned from his extended travels, proclaimed himself delighted to have such a skilled partner. Sheriff Morrison, who had worked with Jasper for years, publicly declared that any man lucky enough to win Eleanor Hartwell's heart deserves congratulations, not condemnation. The wedding took place on a bright June morning at the small church on Elm Street. Eleanor wore her mother's dress, carefully altered with wild roses in her hair that Jasper had picked himself. Half the town came to witness the union, some out of genuine goodwill, others purely for the spectacle of seeing the spinster apothecary marry the silent bounty hunter. As they exchanged vows, Eleanor felt the weight of years of rejection and loneliness lift from her shoulders. When Jasper slipped a simple gold band on her finger and promised to love and protect her for all his days, she knew she had found something rare and precious. A man who chose her not despite her independence and strength, but because of them. The reception was held in the town square, where couples danced under strings of lanterns as music from a traveling fiddle band filled the air. Eleanor watched from Jasper's arms as the same people who had once whispered about her now celebrated her happiness. Some still disapproved. She could see it in their faces, but their opinions had lost the power to wound her. "No regrets," Jasper murmured as they swayed to the music. Eleanor smiled up at him, remembering the frightened, rejected woman she'd been such a short time ago. "Only that it took so long for you to find me. I was looking in all the wrong places," he replied, spinning her gently. "Turns out what I needed was right here in Millfield Creek all along." As the evening wound down and guests began to drift home, Eleanor and Jasper climbed the hill to their new house. From the porch, they could see the lights of the town spread below them like scattered stars. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, the scrutiny of those still uncomfortable with their union, the dangers inherent in Jasper's work, the daily effort of building a life together. But tonight, none of that mattered. Eleanor Hartwell Kane stood beside her husband, no longer the spinster no one would marry, but the woman who had been chosen completely and forever by a man who saw her true worth. In finding Jasper, she had found herself strong, capable, deserving of love. The stars wheeled overhead as they went inside together, ready to begin the life they had claimed against all odds and expectations. Love, Eleanor had learned, wasn't about settling for what others deemed acceptable. It was about finding someone who valued your strength as much as your softness, who chose you not as a last resort, but as their first and only choice. She had waited 28 years to be chosen. The wait, she now knew, had been worth every lonely moment. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.